This event is co-sponsored by the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, the Institute for European Studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies of the Indiana University, and University of Wisconsin-Madison Jean Monnet grants, currently under the directorship of Mark Kopelovich, Jean Monnet Chair. Before we move to the presentations and discussions, I would like to thank all of the panelists and Professor Spoon for making this event possible and for responding to our invitation. My thanks goes to the team of the European Studies Center at Pitt. This event is recorded and it will be available soon at the YouTube channel of the European Studies Center at Pitt. Let me introduce you to our today's guests, and I will start with Professor Spoon, who is a moderator and a co-host of this discussion. J.J. Spoon is Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Political Science Department and a former Director of European Studies Center at Pitt. Her research focuses on comparative electoral behavior, primarily in Europe. She is interested in understanding political party strategies and their outcomes for the party, its elected officials and voters, and how party type and size, institutions and context influence parties' decision-making at both the domestic and European level. She is a co-editor of Research and Politics. Andrea Ceron is Associate Professor at the University of Milan, where he teaches Italian political system, polymetrics, and multivariate analysis. He has been visiting scholar at Harvard University and is co-founder and board member of Voices from the Blogs, SRL, which is an academic spin-off in the field of sentiment analysis. He is currently principal investigator of the PRIN project, Democracy Under Pressure, and editor of the Encyclopedia of Technology and Politics. He has published 8 books and 50 articles in international peer-reviewed journals. Timothy Helwig is a professor of political science and academic director of the Europe Gateway and Indiana University. His interests include comparative and international political economy, mass political behavior, and research methods. He is a co-author of Democracy Under Siege, Parties, Voters, and Elections After the Great Recession, and Globalization and Mass Politics, Retaining the Room to Maneuver. He teaches courses on comparative elections, political economy, European politics, the EU, world politics, and quantitative methods. Maria Solevid is an associate professor in political science and vice head of the Department of Political Science, University of Gothenburg. She is a member of the Swedish National Election Studies Program and the Gothenburg Research Group on Elections, Public Opinion, and Political Behavior. Her research interests are voter turnout, electoral behavior, political participation, political trust, and survey methodology. Her research investigates perceptions of electoral integrity and voter turnout in the 2022 Swedish national elections, how ethnic diversity affects social and political trust, and how voters' social ties matter for economic voting. Professor Rune Stupager is professor of political science at Aarhus University, Denmark. His research interest is political behavior with a particular emphasis on electoral behavior. He is one of the principal investigators in the Danish National Election Study. He is a co-author of The Danish Voter, Democratic Ideals and Challenges. His work investigates also the continuous social and political importance of social class to citizens of advanced democracies. And after this introduction, I'm handing over to our host, J.J. Spoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to see everyone, and I appreciate everyone joining us today on the panel. I know it's evening for many of you, so thank you, and it's great to see that we have so many in the audience as well. We will have time for questions throughout the conversation, so if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure to get to as many of these as I can. So today we will be talking about 3 recent elections in Europe, those in Denmark, in Sweden, and Italy. And we'll first have a bit of a tour to understand what exactly happened in these elections that have all transpired in the last few months, what voting behavior looked like, what the results looked like, etc. And then we'll start the conversation after that. Introductory comments. So with that, I'd like to start with the most recent elections in Denmark. And Brun, if you'd like to give us a bit of an overview of what happened.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be on the panel. I look forward to hearing also a few more details about what's going on in the other countries. For the Danish election just 2 weeks ago, you could say that it's quite an unusual election compared to what we used to have, in the sense that we may be witnessing the first election for several decades in which the two major political blocs are breaking up. At least that's what's potentially the outcome, but we'll see. To take you into the result of the election, we have to actually, to understand it, to go back to the 2019 election, because since then we've seen two significant developments in two sectors of the political spectrum that we need to understand in order to see what's really going on. The first place to look is in the center of the political spectrum, because in the 2019 campaign, the then reigning Prime Minister and chairman of the Liberal Party, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, in the middle of the campaign, without anybody having been warned, launched the idea of a so-called broad government, which would be a government encompassing the Social Democrats and the Liberal Party, the two main opponents who are usually seen as the champions of each their political bloc, the left and the right bloc. And he then, out of the blue, proposed that these two competitors should form a government together. This was refused by the Social Democrats, who, as you may recall, went then on to win the 2019 election and then form the government for the past 3.5 years. But since the Liberal Party lost the election, they thought it was time to replace Lars Løkke Rasmussen as the chairman. And although he didn't want to go, he was forced to resign later in 2019. And over the years, he then left the party and formed a new party, the Moderate Party, that he then got eligible to run in the past election. And if you think this sounds like an episode of Borgen, I'd say you're not too far off. It seems that reality is catching up with the TV series. At the beginning of the current campaign, this Moderate Party was polling just around between 2 and 3%, i.e. over the 2% threshold, but nothing in particular. The Social Democrats on their side were trailing in the polls in the run-up to the election, but they had a pretty strong comeback just in the few months before the election. And indeed, they also, just when the election was called, launched this idea of the broad government as their then #1 priority, which meant that a major issue in the campaign became the idea of forming this broad government. So a lot of the discussion in the campaign was around this issue of who should join the government and should we see this new broad government formed. But the other place where there was an interesting development before the campaign was on the right. Some of you may know that the 2019 election saw a great setback for the Danish People's Party, the right-wing immigration skeptic party. They lost 2/3 of their vote in that election. Partly this was due to competition from two new other immigration skeptic parties. One of them only who made it into parliament. And so the combined support of these immigration skeptic parties in 2019 was 13% of the vote. And just keep that figure in mind for when I give you the results of the current election. After the 2019 election, trouble really continued, but now within the Danish People's Party, they started fighting internally and replaced the leader. And when they did that, more than half of the parliamentary party group left the party. So they were in really bad shape in the run-up to this last election, which paved the way for another splinter party from the Liberal Party, led by a former minister, former deputy leader of the party, Inger Støjberg, who was actually convicted of abusing her powers as a minister, and had just in this past spring served a 2-month prison sentence, although served with an ankle bracelet at home. But she then left, when she took off the bracelet, she went ahead and formed a new party that immediately gained the support of 10 to 12% of the vote, and seemed then to replace the Danish People's Party on the right. So that was a setup. We had these two new parties, two splinter parties from the Liberal Party that really seemed to gain traction before the campaign even began. And so the campaign itself was fought over, as I said, this government question, who should join the government or not. But issue-wise, it was also about the climate change and how to combat that, of course. Healthcare, the issue of how to get a sufficient number of nurses to staff the hospitals. And then, of course, inflation, prices, not least of energy, were some of the major issues in the campaign. And I say that I should mention then also that something that wasn't on the agenda really, and that is the immigration issue, which has topped the agenda at many of the more recent Danish elections. But this time around, it really wasn't at the top of the agenda. It really wasn't discussed very much. And to the extent that it was discussed, it was mostly some of the mainstream parties, although not the Social Democrats, suggesting that, well, little bits and pieces of the current legislation have become too crazy, as they would say. It's become too tough. But other than that, there is a widespread consensus around the current rather strict line on the immigration issue. And because of this, it really wasn't much of a discussion point in the campaign. Then to the election result, the Social Democrats secured an increase over their 2019 result by 1.6 percentage points, so not too much, but it landed them at 27.5, which is the best result they've had since 2001. So we don't see any imminent demise of social democracy in Denmark, I should say. And this came also despite continuous attacks on the Prime Minister, the Social Democratic leader Mette Frederiksen, from the mainstream right-wing parties, who said that she was all too powerful in leading this one-party government. And the part of the ammunition for this attack came from the fact that the government had decided, as a precaution against the spread of the coronavirus, to cull all mink farms in Denmark. All mink was culled, and this may seem an odd thing, but Denmark actually was, prior to 2020, the world's largest producer of mink fur. So it was quite a business, and it was culled just overnight, and it turned out there wasn't really a legal basis for doing it. So of course the opposition has been attacking her on that, but it didn't gain any traction with a sufficient number of voters. At least the party advanced in the election. That wasn't a story for the Red Bloc as a total. They saw a substantial loss of votes, not least led by the Social Liberal Party, who had actually caused the election to be called. They lost a lot of votes, but crucially, they regained a majority, but a majority of only one seat in parliament, which was secured by the combined effect of members of parliament elected in Greenland and the Faroe Islands, who also count towards the overall majority, as well as an odd rule in the election system that has never come into play for the past 80 years, but in this election for the first time secured an extra seat for the Social Democrats. So it was a very slim win, but nevertheless a red-wing majority. The Liberals, as you can imagine, they were cut in three by the two challenger parties. So we have the traditional Liberal Party, who went from around 23% to around 13%. And then we had the two new parties, the spin-offs from them. The Moderate Party, led by the former Prime Minister, had a really good election, polling 9.3%. But crucially also for them, they did not become the pivotal party. So they don't control the balance of power, which they were very close to, but ended up not having. The other spin-off, the Denmark Democrats, led by this former minister, also did really well, polling 8.1%. The Blue Bloc as a total was far away from gaining a majority because this moderate party refuses to be counted as part of the bloc. If you do, you could say that result was pretty much as usual in the sense that you have two blocs facing off one another in a very narrow balance. But if you accept that they're not part of the Blue Bloc, then it's a very different result, and the Blue Bloc is very far from a majority. On the right, the Danish People's Party lost another 2/3 of their votes, so they're now down to 2.6%. And that's where why I asked you to remember the combined support for these immigration skeptic parties in 2019. Now there's 3 of them in parliament. They polled together 14.4%, which is only 1.5% over the result for this type of parties in 2019. So in effect, they're just moving around the same voters now between a new party and some of the older ones. So there doesn't seem to be any growth in that sector of the political system. So in conclusion, and perhaps as an intro also to talking about the government in a little while, I'd say we're now facing a more fragmented, open and unpredictable situation than we've been used to for many years, several decades actually, in Denmark, but also interesting times, you could say. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rune, for that very wide-ranging overview of what is going on in Denmark. Maria, do you want to tell us what's been happening in Sweden?
Yes, I want to share my screen. So what happens in this election in Denmark with the breakup of the blocs that happened in the 2018 election in Sweden? So since 2014, none of the traditional blocs, the red, green, the left side, or the blue center-right side, has been able to form a government on their own. 2014, we had the minority center-right government. In 2018, government formation took 134 days, and the result of that was that the Liberals and the Center Party, the two center-right parties, formed a contract with the Social Democratic and Green Party government, the January contract. That ended during the election term. There was a midsummer crisis in 2021. The Prime Minister Stefan Löfven was voted out, but then he took power again. Then he resigned and handed over to Magdalena Andersson. So she became the first female Prime Minister in Sweden. There was also a bit of chaos around that. So she had been the Prime Minister for roughly 9 months, and she led a minority Social Democratic government. So what happened in the election 2022? There are basically 2 electoral winners. It is the Social Democrats that actually gained 2 percentage points, 30.33%. The largest gain was the Sweden Democrats, which is the second party you see here. That's the anti-immigrant party, the right-wing anti-immigrant party. They have still never lost votes in an election. They have increased for every election that they have participated in, and they got just over 20% this time, 20.5%, and became the second largest party. The old sort of opposition party that typically takes turns with the Social Democrats to form governments, the moderates or the conservatives, they basically just replicated their results from 2018, a little bit less. The left party lost votes, the center party lost almost 2 percentage points, the Christian Democrats too, 1 percentage was down. And the 2 smallest parties, the Green Party and the Liberals, that were both balancing actually under the electoral threshold for quite some time in the polls during the entire period between the 2 elections. They both made it into parliament again, but they lost. The Liberals lost compared to the last election, and the Green Party was actually a small gain. And in the results, with these now new blocks, so to speak, where the Center Party no more belongs to the Blue Bloc, but rather to the Red-Green Bloc, and where the Liberals actually left this January contract in the last election term and sort of went back to the right-wing part, it means that we have two new blocks, and the difference between the two government blocks was only 46,000 votes in the end. So that's quite a narrow win, although the coalitions were not like self-evident, but the likely coalition, government coalitions. And we will talk more about this later on, the government formation and so on. But there was only 3 seats difference in favor of the winners, the new right-wing coalition. So just to make a super short summary of the election, turnout was down 3 percentage points to 84.2%. In Sweden, this is horror. They think it's terrible. Democracy is in crisis. And I try to tell the journalists, this is fine. It's still really high. And we're leading and so on. Only Denmark beats us and or around the same figure. I don't know what the figure was this time in Denmark, but at least compared to the 2019 election. As I said, the Sweden Democrats was the second largest party. That's the main thing, that the Conservatives were not the second largest party. In terms of the topics, according to the voters, it was healthcare, education, law and order, and energy and nuclear power that were the most important issues for voters' party choice. But if you look at the media, the news media agenda, including social media, it was law and order, the energy issue, and integration and migration that dominated the news media. And what's very important is that the right-wing coalition had a clear issue ownership in these issues that very much dominated the agenda. However, we sort of play around a little bit and sometimes call this the presidential election in Sweden, because it was quite a lot of focus of the two prime minister candidates, Magdalena Andersson, who was the incumbent, and Ulf Kristersson, who was in the opposition. And her approval rates were much better than his. She is also viewed as more competent, reliable, and inspiring. So that she really helped the Social Democrats to actually gain votes in this election, even though she had to resign from office. And as I said, the Center Party officially switched side, and they declared support for Magdalena Andersson as the prime minister, although they still want like the old center-right government back, but that is not possible, since what all Swedish politics has been about for roughly 12 years now, but particularly so since 2018, is whether you can speak to the Sweden Democrats or not. And since the Center Party do not want to be in a government that is dependent on the Sweden Democrats, they declared support for the Social Democratic Prime Minister. In terms of voting behavior, we see increasing, although not dramatically increasing, gender differences, but they have increased over time, and they increased also in this election. So basically, there is large shares of women voting for all the parties more to the left, center left in the political spectrum. So for the left party, especially for the Social Democrats, a little bit for the Greens and for the Center Party. While we see the opposite for men, they to a high extent vote especially for the Sweden Democrats, but also the moderates, and very a bit smaller differences for the other parties. So this is interesting. Of course, this is nothing compared to like the class cleavage that used to dominate the Swedish politics for so long, but we see increasing gender differences in party choice. And this is also reflected in the most important political issues for party choice when the voters say what they think. So women prioritized, according to the exit poll, healthcare, education, gender equality, social welfare, elder care, law and order, and so on. Law and order was top among men, in 6th place among women. Energy was second among men. It was 10th place among women. And gender equality, that came fairly high among women, was quite a lot lower prioritized by men, and there are equal differences regarding the climate issue. The election was not about the economy, which was very strange considering that everyone knew what was going to happen. Inflation is high and so on, just as in Denmark. Energy prices are high. So the economy issues were all connected to the energy and whether we should have more nuclear and so on. If you just form these new blocks with the moderates, the Christian Democrats, the Liberals, and the Sweden Democrats on the one hand, and the Social Democrats, the left parties, the Green Party, and the Center Party on the other hand, you see over time that there has been sort of more of a center left majority in Sweden, even though we between 2006 and 2014 had a center-right government, because then the Center Party used to belong to the right side of politics. But as you see among the first-time voters, we see a clear shift to the right among the first-time voters. They have actually in the past been quite a lot to the left, but we see increasingly that they move to the right. But this is not all first-time voters, because if you look on people's ideological identification, we see that women has been more clear to the left over the period of 30 years, while we see that men now more strongly actually move to the right. So large shares of men now identify themselves as clearly to the right. And this is especially so among young men. Young women are still clearly to the left to a quite high extent, actually 25% say that, but you see this increase in young men being clear to the right. So this is very new and intriguing differences that we haven't really seen before, and that we need to dig into in our analysis of the election in the month and years to come. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Maria. All right, now down to Italy. Andrea?
Yeah, thanks. Let me share the screen. Okay. The results of the Italian elections were pretty clear. There was a fine and huge victory by the right-wing coalition, but there is not really a right-wing turn, especially if compared to the 2019 European election. And now let's see why. So overall, Meloni's party, Giorgia Meloni's party, so Brothers of Italy, was the first rank in the election with 26% of vote. And it was followed by the center-left Democratic Party with 19%, more or less the same percentage of the 2008 election, this party, whereas Brothers of Italy registered the hugest increase in Western democracies in terms of votes compared to the previous general election. The Five Star Movement, so the, let's say, center-left populist party, lost more than half of its votes compared to 2018, but it was already so in 2019, and most of these voters had switched to the League, which was another loser of this election, because Salvini's party was rated in the polls at around 34% in 2019, but from that moment on, the party shrunk up to less than 9%, so a big loss for this leadership and for this party. This is at the party level. If we turn to the coalition level instead, we can see that the center-right coalition has a huge gap compared to the center-left, so with around 44% of votes in the popular vote. But the main mistake is that the left failed to coordinate. So the electoral law is a mixed system in which almost 1/3 of the MPs are elected in single-member districts, but there is a single ballot. And so if you want to win in the single-member district, you need to run together. This is what the center-left failed to do. So the Five Star, which was an ally of the Democratic Party until the election campaign began, decided, due to the refusal of the Democratic Party to create an alliance, to go alone. And the same happened with the moderate centrist party called Azione Italia Viva, Italy Alive. And so if you sum up, just by chance, the support for the center-left and the Five Star, which is still on the center-left side of politics now, you can see that the two main coalitions, center-left and center-right, are very, very close to each other. And so also in these single-member districts, we could have had a very different outcome. Instead, the huge support for the center-left, for the center-right compared to the center-left generated a massive win in these districts, and so there is the reason why the parliament provides now a safe majority for the right. But in terms of support, well, the level of support for the right was more or less like now since the beginning. This center-right coalition in 1994. So if you consider Berlusconi's Forza Italia party, the League and National Alliance, the post-fascist party, which now Brothers of Italy, well, the support for these parties were more or less between 40 and 50%, with an average of 42, and this time they got 43, 44%. So perfect in line with their history. Also, in terms of voting behavior, there was just a reshuffle within the center-right coalition. In particular, 1 out of 2 voters of the League moved to Brothers of Italy because they recognize in Meloni a more reliable leadership for this coalition. And the same if we consider Forza Italia voters. So 1 voter of Berlusconi's party out of 3 moved to Brothers of Italy in this election. There was instead no really a movement from the 5-star to the right, especially to the Meloni's party. If we consider the 2019 election result, which is the result of the 5-star when this party had almost already moved toward the center-left side of politics, only 1 voter in 14 switched from the 5-star to Brothers of Italy in this election. So there was not really movement across coalition, but just a reshuffle within the same coalition. And this reshuffle was already in place, as I mentioned before, in 2019. So from 2019 on, you can see the projected election results according to survey polls for the League in green. In summer 2019, Salvini made a strategic mistake by terminating the Conte Force cabinet, the cabinet in which the League was ruling together with the 5-star. And after this termination, he was expecting to have a re-election, but the outcome was a center-left cabinet involving the 5-star and the Democratic Party. And after that mistake, voters felt that this leadership was no longer reliable as a support, as a source of strength for the center-right coalition, and they moved instead toward Brothers of Italy, the blue line, which increased from around 3, 4, 5% of support up to the 26 that we observed in this election. And one last finding that we can consider. So there was also a debate about the end of populism due to the relevance of traditional ideological positions, the right and the left, and so on. And also the decline of the 5-star was a source of comments about the end of populism, but it was really not the case. So here is size of populist support over time, considering the 5-star, but also the League, Brothers of Italy, and the People of Freedom Party, leaving aside Berlusconi Forza Italia, which is sometimes considered a populist party, but other times not. And if you look, starting from 2008, actually, until 2022, the percentage of support for the populist is almost always around 50%. And there is almost no change from 2019, the European election, and the 2022 general election. So there is still a majority support among voters for different populist parties, relying on different ideological position, but still using populist strategies and populist claims. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I now want to turn to Tim to give us a bit of a sort of contextual kind of understanding of these 3 different elections and the things that the 3 panelists just spoke about in terms of broader trends, what we can take away from these elections, if these are sort of characteristics of what we're seeing across elections more generally in Europe. And while he's talking, if you have any questions, those in the audience, about any of the topics that were just discussed, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat, and I will get to those before we move on to the next topic. Tim?
Yeah, thanks, JJ, and thanks, everybody. These are really informative and interesting summaries from Maria and Andrea on the elections. And so my attempt here will be to try to weave some things together. And I think I wanted to focus on two themes, and I'd be curious later in Q&A what our other panelists think of my take on these things. But one theme would be the fate of what these elections mean for social democracy, and another what these elections should tell us about populism and the state of populism in Europe today. And so for social democracy, it's interesting because there's been a lot of talk, in countries about, the reestablishment of the left, the end of neoliberalism, and we see kind of a counterweight to the far right emerging on the far left, especially in Mediterranean countries. But these elections, it seems to me, suggest that that the kind of social democracy that is winning might be more of, or at least the social democracy that finds success might be more of the moderate version, and not so much the bold left, advanced, broad-based social policy, social leaning reforms. So I was thinking about the Danish case that Rune talked about. Right now you have one of the most fragmented parliaments in Denmark for many years after the elections, and as Rune mentioned, some of the reason, some of the problems for the Social Democrats in the previous government were caused, yes, by the blue bloc being upset at Fredriksen's executive authority, overreach for COVID policies, things like this. But as I understand, there was also the liberals, the social liberals, rather the radical liberals, were really also somewhat upset with the Social Democrats and Fredriksen, and saw that as really a basis for weakening their support in the previous government, on the Red government before the election. And so what you really see is that a weakening of the coherency on the left in Denmark, it seems to me, and this election in which Fredriksen's Social Democrats did quite well, and the Social Liberals did quite poorly, is an endorsement for her kind of social democracy. And another sort of, and this includes, for example, I would say more of a centrist and even more restrictionist angle on the immigration question as well. So it seems to me you see more of a people have called Fredriksen kind of flexible, right? But that's a code word for sort of wishy-washy in a way, right? Or at least not wanting to stay and favor power and control rather than taking dramatic sort of leftward leaning policies like we might expect from a social democratic party. And then you turn to Sweden, and I was trying to make sense of this as well. The Social Democrats under Andersson does better than it's a party than they had done the last two electoral cycles, but then also loses the prime ministership because the Sweden Democrats are now sort of seen as the advise and consent partners to make it possible for a bourgeois, still call it bourgeois government, center right government in Sweden. And so this suggests to me there's chatter after Löfven was sort of stepped down from the prime minister about Andersson pushing the party more to the left. And I was wondering, I wonder what Maria thinks about this, is maybe that this is a cautionary tale for the Social Democrats in Sweden. Because on the one hand, it was a good election. On the other hand, and maybe underline the fact of the stability of the Social Democrats, but what kind of social democracy do the Swedes want? It seems to me it's not terribly progressive, right, or expansionary type of social democracy, but more competency based if they favor the Social Democrats. So and then Italy, trying to put them into this theme I'm trying to draw. I like what Andrea said, or reminded us that it really wasn't this right-wing wave, right? But it was just an important reshuffling and shifting within the right, within the left. And I liked your slide, which showed really the Democratic Party really doing just like it has done fairly consistently, right? Not a lot of change if you look at the PD, that red line on your graph. And so the question there for me is, what kind of social policies, welfare policies will we see out of Brothers of Italy-led government? And that's an interesting question. Is Meloni going to go more austerity policies, or is she going to be less concerned about balanced budgets and try to increase the welfare state in a time where the center left in Italy is not as, I would say, bold in terms of its policy proposals? Maybe she sees this as an opening to develop popular policies. Early chatter has seen that that she's not going to be as, she's not going to take Italy as far off the course as Draghi did with respect to Europe or Ukraine, or even perhaps some of the social family values types issues that people might have feared. So I guess trying to put that in my social democracy thing is that it's not so much if you get a social democrat, you're going to see the welfare state expand, right? It's not that easy anymore because of these multi-party coalition politics that we see in all of these countries. So that's my social democracy take. And then populism is also very interesting, because if you look at these in context, you see, well, in Denmark, and Rune described this very well, so I don't have to do very much of this, but the Danish People's Party is a very, it's one of the things that we know about Denmark. We can go back and we can see that we had the progress, I guess the Progress Party, right, and then the People's Party, and this is a very strong element of Danish politics. That's one of the reasons why non-Danes sometimes want to study Denmark. But you see that the People's Party strength has ebbed, and Rune spelled out, you see the splintering of the populist on the populist vote. And so this, so I'll just put a bookmark in that. And then Italy, you see migration from Lega to Fratelli d'Italia, right? So that's interesting, right? You see kind of movement of these voters. And in Sweden, I was trying to think about that the Sweden Democrats have been the real success story, as Maria said, growing in strength all the time. And I thought to myself, they seem the odd person out here. And I think that maybe because of the threshold, right? The higher threshold in Swedish politics, maybe due to strong leadership in the Sweden Democrats. But the Danish and Italian cases especially maybe ask things like, can these parties really develop into policy-centric parties? And if they can, will it be around the anti-immigrant question? And if that's the case, how much wind is in that sails, and to the extent that other parties, like let's say the Danish Social Democrats, have co-opted or blunted the immigration issue quite effectively, right? So these elections, I don't think were really well, it's hard to say that, right? I was going to say there weren't really a rising endorsement for populism as an electoral strategy, but there's not as much clarity, for example, in terms of populism overtaking European elections broad-based as I think we might have seen, back in 2016, 2017, 2018. So I guess those are some thoughts I have on this, and I welcome others' comments. And then JJ, I had some thoughts about the larger European context, but did you want me to
maybe hold off on that until later?
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Thank you, Tim. That was great. I want to give everyone a couple of minutes to briefly respond, because I think Tim brought up some really interesting points, some things perhaps a bit more controversial. And so, but I also want to make sure that we get to the next part of the conversation. So I'll go around to each of you, and if you want to respond either on the sort of social democracy point or populism, or in like 2 minutes, say something about both. And then we can come back to things later as well. So Maria, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you, Tim. This was really insightful comments. So regarding the sort of the position of social democracy in Sweden, I mean, they have been they have received criticism for putting power or remaining in power like the main like goal, and Magdalena Andersson toned down in the campaign. She wanted to collaborate, and I agree with my opponent, and yeah, and she's quite fearful otherwise. She's known for her temper and that she's tough in debates and so on. And I don't know if the Social Democrats went that much left in this particular campaign. They of course have governed on quite liberal policies the past 4 years, because the January contract with primarily the Center Party was a lot of liberal politics in that, because the Social Democrats wanted to remain in power. So I think there were some like left-leaning suggestions, which they also have support for in the public opinion, but those issues did not rise to the top of the agenda, and therefore they weren't sort of not rewarded for wanting to put a roof on how much like money private providers of public health care how much revenue they can make and so on. So it's interesting. Still, I mean, she was important for the party. The Social Democrats, they increased in the polls both during the initial phases of the pandemic and also after the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the membership of application for Sweden for NATO and so on. So I mean, they have been faring quite well in the polls, made a good election, but basically their government friends didn't make as good of a campaign. Regarding populism, I just want to say that it's so interesting that in Sweden that we moved from this focus from immigration after the migration crisis. We moved and we have, you know, dramatically changed our migration and immigration policy, and we moved from being a very generous country in that respect to having very sort of strict immigration laws and so on. But now when everyone agrees on that, when everyone is basically where the Sweden Democrats were like a couple of years ago, we have now shifted to, okay, being tough on immigrants, like law and order, criminality, those issues. So, and although all parties have become more strict, more authoritarian, that perhaps some exceptions, Sweden Democrats still continue to increase, even though, so it doesn't matter whether these issues are on their playing field or not, they just continue to increase. And the party leader, Jimmie Åkesson, is super important. 48% of the Sweden Democratic voters said that he was an important reason for why they voted for the party. So he basically broke the record of being the most important party leader ever for his voters, so to speak, or for the votes of the Sweden Democrats. And now they are not in the government, but they have a contract with the government. They are supporting the government. So yeah, we'll talk more about that, I guess, in the next session.
Great, thank you. Andrea.
Yeah. So the big question is, where is the social democracy in Italy now? And a potential answer is that, well, the five-star movement actually ran on a pretty fair social democratic platform. So they were in favor of welfare state. They defended the minimum income policy, which is classical element of social democracy. They proposed the minimum wage for workers and environmental protection, libertarians' views on gender balance, civil rights, drugs, and whatever else. And actually, to be honest, also the Democratic Party moved toward these policies. This party was internally divided since the beginning into a moderate faction, which later was associated with the Renzi leadership, and another faction which was more traditionally social democratic. Now Renzi left the party. He is one of the two leaders of this Azione Italia Live electoral culture. And the other faction of the Democratic Party moved back to the left, supporting minimum wage, supporting the citizen minimum income as well. But surprisingly, they refused to form an alliance because they defended the more moderate platform of the last cabinet, the Draghi cabinet. So they decided to make these strategic mistakes in terms of alliances. And now, due to this mistake, they are discussing internally once again which direction should they take, whether they should move to the center to attract liberal voters or stay on the left and try to form an alliance, a left-wing alliance with the Five Star. And there is also an ongoing huge debate about the rebranding of this party to give a clear idea of the aim that the party will pursue in the next decades. On the other side, well, I will talk later about the government policy, but just to give an idea, well, the center-right is very cohesive in terms of policies. The three parties, the main three parties, are close to each other according to the experts, but also according to voters and so on. And so it is not surprising that we observe that huge switch in terms of voters from one party to the other, from the League to Brothers of Italy, or from Forza Italia to Brothers of Italy, just because they are so close that they evaluated other elements, typical balance elements, including the leadership and the charisma of the leader, and so they decided just to switch toward the party with the highest reputation.
Great, thank you. Rune.
Yes, I think Tim is right in saying that the Danish Social Democrats are flexible policy-wise. At least they've shown themselves to be in this election on certain issues, at least primarily on the economic dimension. I'd say they, out of the blue, proposed tax cuts, albeit for low incomes, but that was part of the running ticket, you could say, to actually cut taxes. And indeed, they also, and the Prime Minister, sort of, there was talk about her developing what some thought was a new personality. She was more open, more friendly, more smiling, and as her Swedish colleague, Andersson, she also reached out and embraced her opponent's proposals and said in debates, "Oh, I think there's a lot we can agree on if we form this broad government." I'll talk later about the sincerity of this, which of course is a question, but just I want to mention that there's one point or one type of policy in which is not at all flexible, and that's the immigration policy. They're actually sticking to their guns, and whenever some of the right or center parties said, "Oh, there are these crazy rules that mean that otherwise well-integrated people have to leave the country," they said, "Well, okay, that's the price we have to pay to keep the strict immigration policy we want." So in that sense, they were actually more to the right than some of the usual right-wing competitors. And the reason for this is that they're scared to death of being seen as going soft, going back left on immigration, because then they fear that, and I think that's the correct assessment, that they would then be vulnerable to attacks from the Danish People Party, the Denmark Democrats, who also want strict immigration policies, and these types of parties. So they really want to stick to that. So they're not at all flexible when it comes to that issue area. Of course, and that is part of the problem, you could say, for the Danish populist parties, at least the immigration skeptic ones, is that all of the mainstream parties have basically adopted the immigration policy that the Danish People Party was advocating for, well, since the late 1990s, and now that's the mainstream position. And it becomes difficult then for them to sort of come up with new ideas, because in order to keep moving to the right, they get into really crazy territory, you could say. In the last election, we had the populist immigration skeptic party that didn't make it into parliament. They were actually talking about deporting people who have a citizen right or the right to stay in Denmark. None of the other parties have gone that far, but that illustrates how far you have to go to sort of go more to the right than the current consensus. But I would say that we have now potentially a new brand of populism, in the sense of this, in the form of this moderate party, which to some extent is a centrist populist party. They campaign on this idea of coming together and finding sensible solutions and just, you know, engineering the welfare state, and then everybody will be happy and there won't be any conflicts, without going too much into the details of this. I think that has some ring of populism, of course, not the idea of the elite against the people, but it's clearly not a very superficially developed position. But yeah, I think that was what I wanted to say for now.
Great, thank you all. So I am aware of the time. It's so much to discuss, but I want to make sure that we keep to our hour and a half that we decided on for both the panelists and the audience. So we're going to move now, and I'm aware of questions we have, so I will get to them at the end, not to worry. But for the moment, I want to turn to talking about the governments that were formed out of these elections, or are still in the process of being formed as well. So we'll do kind of the same tour we did before. If I can ask everyone to try and keep your comments a bit shorter, just so that we have some time for discussion and questions. I know there's so much to talk about, so I know it's hard, but if you could do that. So why don't we start with Andrea this time?
Yeah, let me share the screen again. Okay. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the cabinet is super cohesive. You can see your estimate based on expert surveys, and you see the three parties, Forza Italia, Brothers of Italy, and the League, are pretty close to each other, especially on law and order issues. This could suggest a certain degree of government stability, but we are in Italy, so we can always find a reason to terminate a cabinet earlier. And in this case, we should be aware of the Salvini's League, because Salvini lost a lot of votes compared to 2019 in particular. So this party may want to get its voters back, and so they can, maybe not immediately, but as time passes, they can start to complain against the Meloni's policies to increase and to get the support of voters disappointed by the Meloni cabinet. In terms of majority, well, for the center-right is quite safe. You see in the House, the majority is 200 MPs. They have 235, and also in the Senate, which is around 100, they have 15 senators more than needed. It is also an oversized coalition because there is a small centrist group, which is formed also by some Brothers of Italy members, actually. And this group was formed also to avoid potential risk with the defection of Forza Italia. So in case of a defection of the Berlusconi's party, the current cabinet only needs 2 senators and 6 members in the House to get a safe majority anyway. And so this is an assurance against a potential defection of this party. Another element that Meloni exploited to make sure the cabinet can last for a while is that she overpaid her allies in terms of candidacies. So despite the figures of the survey polls, she decided to give to the League and to Forza Italia more members in the single member districts than they should have expected to get. And so based on this, despite having 60% of votes within the center-right coalition, Italy only got 50% of MPs, and accordingly, in line with the Council law, if we want, this party got 50% of posts in the cabinet, considering junior ministers. So by overpaying the ally, the attempt is to make the cabinet last longer. And one final element about this cabinet formation process is the fact that it was a huge portfolio design, change in portfolio design with the reshuffles, especially involving the name of some ministers, and ideological buzzwords were added to these names. In particular, you can see the Minister of Economic Development became Minister for Enterprises and Made in Italy. The same for agriculture. Now it is agriculture and food sovereignty. So kind of protectionist term, maybe. In terms of gender balance, well, we had a Minister for Equal Opportunities involved in gender balance things. Now this was merged with the Minister of Family, and the word natality was added. So we can expect also some bonus for natality policies. And then two last changes in terms of buzzwords. Energetic security was added to the name of the Minister of the Environment. So instead of talking about ecological transition, we'll talk more about energetic security to deal with the energy crisis. And in terms of education, the word merit was added. So no longer the Minister for Education, but Minister for Education and Merit, to highlight that the center-right is in favor of meritocracy. Yeah, thank you.
Very interesting. I didn't know they changed it to the Made in Italy portfolios. Very interesting. Maria.
Oh yes, so what, as I said before, the new government coalition consists of the moderate party, that is the Conservatives, with the Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, and he rules together with the Liberals and the Christian Democrats, and they have a very long and tight contract together with the Sweden Democrats that are outside of the government coalition. It took them 2.5 weeks to form governments, more or less, and this agreement, the formal agreement, was made in on a castle, so it's called so the deal has the name from this castle. It's evident that so everyone says that basically the Sweden Democrats are not in the back seat; they are in the front seat. They get a lot of policy. That's what the Ulf Kristersson pays, the currency he pays them for being able to be the prime minister. So they received a lot of chairmanships in the parliamentary committees. That was the first time ever they have been chairmen in the parliamentary committees. They received after some discussion also one of the vice speakers in the parliament. Policy-wise, it's clear that the Sweden Democrats are not right-wing in terms of economic terms. They want to keep the unemployment benefits at the current levels. They want to increase the sick leave insurance and so on. And this is like big no-no to the Liberal and the Conservatives. Instead, the Sweden Democrats wants to reduce the foreign aid, which traditionally neither the Christian Democrats nor the Liberals want. But what has happened is that foreign aid will be reduced. Sweden will still be a top foreign aid giver in the world, but it will be significantly reduced. And the unemployment benefits is kept at this post-pandemic level, so clear win for the Sweden Democrats in that respect. It's been a lot of discussion that there is no longer a Ministry of Climate and Environment. There is still a minister or secretary for this, but it's now under the Minister of Enterprise and Innovation. So that's been a lot of discussion about that. Sweden, for the first time in almost 30 years, don't have a special ministry for climate and environment. Lots of discussion about diesel prices, petrol and gas prices. Economists have been criticizing the government for inducing even more inflation because they wanted to subsidize this and lower the prices. But when the budget proposition came last week, it was a quite restrictive budget. So there's been a lot of discussion now that they cannot keep all their promises. The Sweden Democrats said that diesel should be like $1 less costly, and the actual reduction now is just so tiny. So that I'm talking about a populist election promise. So there are shifts. Climate policy is clearly different with the new government, but otherwise we see this clear mix with both liberal and center policy and the different wins basically that the Sweden Democrats has policy-wise. In law and order and immigration, they were so more on agreement. We will have this. Let's see what happens with anonymous witnesses and visitation zones and whatnot.
Great, thank you for that. Runa.
Yes. Well, I don't have much to say because we don't have a new government. They're still negotiating. And we're expecting it to be an unusually long process this time around because they are, in fact, trying to form this broad coalition, even though there is the red bloc majority. And what seems to be, it seems now to be hanging on the Liberals, basically. And they have to decide for themselves whether they want to join, which they had refused. They completely refused this idea of the broad government during the campaign. Now they seem to be more open. Of course, they would then be able to gain some power, some influence and portfolios by joining, but it would also make them the target of all their former friends in the blue bloc who would throw themselves at them and try to tear them apart for selling out and reinstalling this prime minister who is known for being all too powerful and stuff like that. So it would be a tough U-turn for them, basically, on that, and they would need to find some good explanation for why they want to do it. As I said, the election result deprived the moderates of their role as a pivotal party. Otherwise, they would have kept us waiting for hours, or for months, potentially, for trying to form this broader government. But since the election also gave this slim majority for the red bloc, that also is an option if this broad deal falls apart. And we'll see. It probably will have to take a while because there's, of course, then the discussion about who's to blame if this broad idea, which is generally very popular, sort of at least at a superficial level with the voters, if that doesn't fly, then they'll have to fight over whose fault it is. And for it to be credible that they have tried, in fact, it has to take a while. So we'll see. I don't know whether it's a sincere wish on behalf of the Social Democrats to actually enter into such a government. At least it's given them an extra option. Now they don't just have to go back to their red bloc partners who will then try to exert the concessions from them. They have this other option as well. So it gives them more leeway in the negotiations. Personally, I find it difficult to see the Liberals joining such a coalition. I think it would be very risky for them. But they are getting drawn into it by the hour, it seems. So more and more so. So we'll see what happens. It'll be interesting.
Great, thank you. Tim, do you want to give some thoughts on the two governments we have, the one that we don't have yet, and kind of put things into larger perspective?
Yeah, I'll be pretty brief. I just want to. So my students here in the United States, when I talk about multi-party governments, they're like, well, yeah, that sounds cool, but at the end, don't they just revert back to, left and right, as the blue bloc and the red bloc, as you say? And I say, well, of course, yeah, there is that story, but these elections tell us that that's not always necessarily the case, right? I mean, you have a center-right government in Italy, but we don't want to, as Maria talked about, the Sweden Democrats are such a polarizing force. They knocked the center party out of the blue side, as it were, and so you have a government now, as you said, that really though its prime minister is on the center right, you really is relying quite a bit on a entirely different animal, as it were, in terms of the political spectrum. So I think that's important. And then what this is very interesting in the broader context to think about this broad coalition or in the moderate party. And I think it's in Denmark, and it's really interesting to think about. It does give the Social Democrats an increased room to maneuver, you would think, at least, the threat of that, right? They actually have more power, which is quite fascinating to think about that in a broader context. So that's interesting. Two more points I wanted to make. One is, what do these elections tell us about the future of sort of liberalism and democracy, right? Among the world's liberal democracies, many of which are in Europe. I think when we think about that from the United States perspective, we get drawn to countries like large countries like France and Germany, and there's been a concern about this, of course, with Macron and his party not winning strongly in the National Assembly this year, and then the sort of learning while doing chancellor in Germany, Scholz, and so here, these countries suggest that this is still a concern. I think that it still remains to be seen how strong there is a sense for liberalism in the broader sense. And that leads to my last question: is what are the future lines of political contestation in Western Europe? I think we'd seen a few cycles ago that a shift away from a state versus market or a left-right to more of an integrationist, de-integrationist Europe versus nation first, anti-immigration nexus. But now that, as many of you talked about, sometimes the immigration issue has sort of been diffused, right, and gone mainstream, where does that leave us in terms of what parties are going to be fighting about, as it were, on the policy grounds? Rather, they could fight about executive authority or, I don't know, style matters or things like that, but that's not really what we hope for our politics. We want them to be about issues, and I'm curious to see how this develops over the next few years. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Tim. So what I'm going to do, since we're don't have much time left, is I'm going to ask a few of the questions from the audience, and then we'll, after we kind of do that, and circle back and kind of have some closing comments. If you want to respond to any of the points that Tim made or reflect on those, you can do that then. Okay, so a few really good questions that audience members have raised. So the first one is actually about Green parties. And the comment is, and obviously the Greens were sort of absent from most of the discussions in the three countries that you've talked about. And they specifically ask, how the lack of large breakthroughs by parties in this party family, in the Green Party family, during any of these three elections. So how do you see this? What explains this? They say they particularly find it strange in the case of Sweden, where the Green Party remains relatively weak despite the Fridays for the Future movement and despite the energy being high up on the agenda. So Maria, since Sweden was called out first, would you like to offer your thoughts on that?
Well, rumor is that not even Friday for Future's advocates voted for the Green Party. So so I don't know really what happened there. But the Green Party has sort of been accused or been criticized for, perhaps is more correct, to have a too technical framing on their policies, which makes them hard to sort of grasp for the everyday citizen, basically, in Sweden. But I mean, it's still, of course, a very interesting position when we talk so much about climate policy and how we need to move forward on those issues, and the climate meeting taking place now, and so on. And still, these parties don't fare better in the elections. I mean, to some extent, other parties have also adopted the Green Party's agenda. Even the Sweden Democrats have tiny sentences on environment rather than climate, perhaps, even though the party leader keeps saying that he's not a climate skeptic, not in a conspiracy way, but he refuses some of the evidence for the climate change and so on. So there is concern, I would say, in Sweden right now, why these issues were not more salient on the agenda. And now when we talked about energy prices, then everything was just down to basically a fight between wind power and nuclear power, and how we can produce and keep more of the electricity that we produce. So yeah, interesting situation, I say, and a big challenge.
Great, thanks. Thoughts about the Greens in Denmark or Italy? Or we can move on if not.
I can just say briefly that we do actually have a Green Party in Denmark called the Alternative Party, and they also made it into parliament, although they were polling badly before the election. But as Maria suggested for Sweden, it's the same story in Denmark, that that the other parties have adopted the agenda, and so there's not in that sense that an urgent need for a Green Party. At least they can't benefit from that agenda. They don't have that to themselves. There's agreement among basically all parties in the Danish Parliament that we should reduce carbon emissions by 70% by 2030. So that agenda is already there, and yeah, so that's why they don't make that much headway, I would say.
Yeah, and in Italy, we always had a very, very tiny Green Party. This time, this party was running an alliance with the left, with the far left, and they got a decent percentage of voters, 3.6, passing the threshold for the first time in quite a few years, actually. But in general, in Italy, the role of the Green Party has been played by the Five Star Movement, definitely, because they started in 2013 with a platform based on the ecological transition, and also they pushed the Draghi cabinet to turn the name of that minister into ecological transition. So that's it. The Democratic Party, of course, as well, is aligned on pro-environmental issues, but they also retain some elements leading to more interest into the economy, especially due to the energy crisis. And surprisingly, or well, not surprising really, this energy crisis has cancelled out any debate about environmental protection during the campaign, despite the fact that we also had a natural disaster during the campaign. So just for a couple of days, all parties have been talking about natural disasters, but then suddenly stopped, or at least the center-right and the main party suddenly stopped to talk about that and get back to the energy and the economy and the inflation and so on.
All right, thank you all. Okay, so we have a question. This is for Bruna on Denmark. So the question is, what role did the Social Democrats' policy of sending refugees to Rwanda play in the election? And how will that affect the chances of forming a coalition that includes the Social Liberals, which strongly oppose that policy?
It didn't play much of a role. It was a bit in the background. There's quite a lot of discussion about whether it's at all realistic. As you may know, Britain has a similar policy, and they have an agreement with Rwanda, which we don't have yet. But they haven't yet, as far as I'm aware, been able to send a single refugee to Rwanda. So it seems to be very difficult. But it is true that the Social Liberal Party, the Radikale Venstre, are very strongly opposed to this. They're center right on the economy, but left on immigration, and so they want a softening of the general policy, and certainly have said they wouldn't support a government even moving ahead with this idea. But they lost 60% of their vote in the election, and as a result of that, their former chairman resigned, and now they have a new chairman who is believed to be more flexible, to use that word again, also on this issue. And it is clear for them that if they want to enter a government, they have to find some way of backing on this. Interestingly, however, what they're saying is that they don't want Denmark to pursue this idea alone, but if we were to do it along with others, they would like the entire EU to be on board, but just a few others would make it acceptable to them. So there is some form of room to maneuver, and we'll see. None of the other parties really want them in the government because they are afraid that they will then be associated with their liberal stance on immigration. So they have to force their way into the government, which is, will be also interesting to follow.
Great, thank you. Although we do have some other good questions. I think we're unfortunately running a bit short on time, so I apologize for those we can't get to. What I want to do in our last about 9 minutes or so is to give everyone, including Tim, who I'll end with, so you have the final word, a couple of minutes to kind of respond to any of the comments Tim made in the last round on sort of dimensions of contestation, things that I asked you to consider as well about sort of what policy may look like moving forward on either domestic issues, European issues, what have you, in these new governments or in the potential new government that we don't necessarily have yet in Denmark. So whatever you'd like to take, and then, as I said, we'll end with Tim, who can have the final word here. So why don't we start in Sweden, Maria?
Okay, so regarding like European Union issues, we have both the party that loves EU the most, the Liberal, and we have the party that sort of until recently just actually moved the sentence out that Sweden should like not be a member of EU. So Sweden Democrats have, I mean, they have moved in a more EU friendly direction, but they're are still skeptics. I think what we will see on a lot of policy issues that things that Sweden has been known for being like top in the class in the EU, we will like resort to like just do the bare minimum. Quota refugees, why should we do more than any other EU country? We have already done so much. So I think that we will see this on a couple of, on several different policies. Some probably on climate and environment, and others on migration and so on. Otherwise, let's see what happens when they move forward with the policies, and how much. I think it will be interesting. They promised a lot, and many governments do that, but Swedish governments tend to fulfill a lot of their promises. So it will be interesting to see the debate now, especially where the Sweden Democrats have advocated for certain policies, like the sharp price decreases on diesel and so on, or gas, and how the fact that they will not be able to fulfill this at all, how if that will influence how the polls or people's view on them at all. They have been sort of untouchable so far. Let's see whether that remains. Otherwise, I think the situation in Denmark, where everyone agrees now on immigration and law and order and criminality issues, so then other issues can sort of be salient again. I think that would be like the dream for all of the, especially like red-green parties, the center-left parties in Sweden, because they then perhaps economic issues other than how much money we pay for energy and so on, or electricity will rise on the agenda again.
Great, thank you. Andrea.
Yeah, just a couple of words about the projected policies of the cabinet, and especially economy, also to answer to Tim's question before. So the very first act of the cabinet was to promote stricter rules against the rave parties. So a typical law and order policy, and also on immigration they are adopting as expected actually, and as they promised actually in their actual campaign, tough policies. So they will try to reject new immigrants, illegal immigrants, and so on. We can expect law and order policies of any other type over the years. The second point is, of course, the economy. So the first thing is the energy crisis, which is a typical context for Western Europe so far, in the last decade, of course. So to answer to this, the cabinet decided to increase the deficit, which is not really a good news for us and for the next generation especially. So the projected deficit ratio between the deficit and the PIL would be 4.5 or around 5%, whereas the European Union requires us to stay within the 3% limit. But we are lucky because the rules are changing at the European Union level. So now they will consider the deficit bill getting rid of the interest on debt. And if we consider revenues minus expenditures net of the interest for past debt, well, Italy is producing a primary surplus since 1990, more or less. So we can possibly afford these new rules, actually. Even though the cabinet is also, despite being a conservative cabinet with a liberal democratic economic policy, they also want to spend more for welfare state, but just for some categories, in particular for pensions, whereas they want to cut the minimum income scheme for sure. And they will also try to lower taxes for both enterprises and workers in order to increase the employment rate.
Great, thank you. Rune.
Thank you. Well, I guess I have a boring answer in the sense that I don't expect policies to change much either way, irrespective of which type of government we end up with, because we already have a strong tradition of broad legislative agreements and parties coming together across the two blocks when it comes to actual policy. So, and that will continue no matter what type of government is formed. So it won't change very much. We won't change our position basically on anything to do with the EU. What may be the main difference between left bloc based government and this broad government is that the latter may be able to roll through more sort of wide-ranging reforms of certain parts of the welfare sector, where we may see cuts in some forms of unemployment benefits, or at least attempts to get more people to join the labor force in order to be able to then raise more taxes to pay for other parts of the welfare system, not least the healthcare sector, where there's the perception that, well, we need to increase salaries, for instance, for nurses. We also need to generate more money to pay to build up our defense. Our armed forces are in a pretty bad situation, and now all of a sudden we've discovered we may need them. And we've promised back in 2014 that we'd live up to the 2% requirement as a NATO member, and we're now promising to do that by 2033, even though people may say that that may be a little bit late. But these would be, I think, the main differences. So it would mostly be within the country, and it would all be middle of the road. Of course, with the left-based majority, there may be a little better conditions for some of the more vulnerable groups in society, but there's a limit to still how far right the Social Democrats could go on such issues without then coming under too much criticism on the left side. So, yeah, I don't see very large changes irrespective of what happens with respect to the government.
Great, thank you. Tim, final thoughts.
Well, it's hard to have final thoughts, but one I'll just say in terms of, because there's so much out there, but I was struck by Maria's graph on the gender divide among young men, and that leads me to a thought thinking about policy, and that's something that I think we should, if we had another panel, it'd be interesting to talk about. Is there are these new social divides. Rune has written about educational divides, and there's also in Denmark today you hear talk about Copenhagen versus the rest, and this is kind of a rural-urban divide that we've heard in a lot of countries, and of course you have regional divides. And so I'm wondering how these new governments are going to try to advance social policy, and then of course there's demographic aging in many of these countries. How are they going to handle these kinds of decisions about where to spend money on that may lead to exacerbating these generational, educational, gender, or place divisions? So I think those might be something to think about if we had time to think more about the voting coalitions behind these parties, which then in turn are behind the governments.
Great, thank you. Well, we are out of time. This was a great discussion. I know we could have, of course, continued and lots more things to discuss, but I think this was a really fascinating discussion. I learned a lot from all of you, and I know our audience members have now a broader perspective on these different elections, as well as some of the trends that we're seeing across Europe, and hopefully we'll now be following developments as they come in various countries. So thank you to our panelists, and I will turn it over to Pablo just to finish things up.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists, for being with us. Thank you for everyone for being with us. Before we end, I want to thank also the sponsoring centers and draw your attention to our upcoming events, which is our lecture series called Conversations on Europe on December 6th. John Markov and Mohammed Baime will be talking about relevant and connected topic on state of democracy in Europe. Please visit our website to register to that event and to follow on any other events that we're organizing at the center. And thank you for being with us tonight. Goodbye.
Bye. Great to be with you. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.